Coalition's Forgotten Legion, a cautionary tale, from Sol System. Coalition's Forgotten Legion, a cautionary tale, from Sol System. I found the file on a Tuesday. Not that Tuesdays mean anything to me anymore. I am a Drellin, and my species does not measure time in the 7-day cycles that humans once used on their homeworld. But I have worked alongside humans long enough that their old calendar rhythms have seeped into the way I think, the way I mark moments. Tuesday, a slow day, a day when nothing important was supposed to happen. My name is Velkarath 7. I am the senior archivist at the Galactic Coalition Historical Record Bureau, located on Thesara Prime, the capital world of the Drellin hegemony. My office sits on the 43rd floor of the Bureau Tower, and from my window I can see 3 moons, and, on clear nights, the soft glow of the orbital station where the Coalition's governing council meets. It is a beautiful view. I have looked at it every morning for 17 cycles and barely noticed it. That is what routine does to you. It makes beauty invisible. On that Tuesday, I was doing what I always do: sorting, cataloging, filing reports that other people had deemed too old or too minor to deal with themselves. The Bureau receives approximately 4,000 new documents per cycle, and approximately 3,900 of them end up on my desk because they belong to categories no one else wants to touch. Old correspondence, expired treaties, records from systems that had been reclassified, absorbed, dissolved, or simply forgotten. Forgotten. That word again. The file came to me in a standard gray transport sleeve, the kind used for dormant records, things the system had flagged as needing review, but that no one had reviewed in so long that the review itself had become a historical artifact. I opened it without particular curiosity. Inside was a thin stack of documents, a data chip sealed with a 30-year-old encryption tag, and a small paper card, actual paper, which told me the file was very old, with a handwritten note in faded ink. The note said, "Sol System, follow-up pending. Status check overdue." There was no name attached to the note, no date, just those words, in careful handwriting that suggested whoever wrote them had genuinely intended to come back to it. They never came back to it. I set the paper card aside and opened the first document. It was a membership application. The header read, "United Earth Government, Sol System, Sector 7 of the Western Rim." The application was neatly prepared, translated into 7 coalition languages, and signed by 17 different government representatives from a world called Earth. The date on the application was 847 cycles ago, which by human reckoning was approximately 800 years. 800 years. I sat back in my chair and read the application again, more carefully this time. The humans had prepared it with great effort. They had included population counts, resource inventories, territorial maps, and a detailed account of their species' history up to that point. There was even a short section that read, in the translated version, something like, "We understand we are small. We understand we are new to the wider community of species. We are not asking for special treatment. We are asking for a chance to contribute." That section had been underlined. Someone at the Bureau, long before my time, had underlined it in red ink. I do not know if the underline was meant to highlight the sentiment as admirable or to note it as naive. The next document was the Coalition's response. It was formal and polished in the way that all Coalition documents from that era were, full of long words and careful phrasing that managed to say a great deal while meaning very little. The response granted the humans provisional auxiliary member status. I had to look that classification up because it is not one currently in use. What I found was that provisional auxiliary membership was a category created during the second expansion period to handle species that were considered too underdeveloped for full membership, but too politically inconvenient to simply reject. It gave them a membership number, a file reference, and a seat at meetings they were never actually invited to attend. It was, I realized as I read, a polite way of saying, "You are not really a member, but we will let you believe you are." Along with the membership status, the Coalition had assigned the humans a posting, the Keth-Voran frontier. I pulled up the sector maps on my terminal. The Keth-Voran corridor was a long, narrow stretch of outer rim space, sparse and unremarkable, far from any major trade routes or strategic positions. The Coalition's own survey notes from that period described it as an area of minimal strategic value, with no known advanced civilizations, and no anticipated developments of concern. In plain language, it was the end of nowhere. The kind of posting you give someone when you want them out of sight. The humans had been given a charter. The charter outlined their responsibilities, which amounted to maintaining a presence in the corridor and reporting any unusual activity, and their entitlements, which included a communication frequency for regular contact with Coalition Command, and the promise of resupply support as logistics permit. That last phrase, as logistics permit, is the oldest trick in bureaucratic language. It promises everything and guarantees nothing. There was one more document in the file. It was a communication log, a record of all transmissions sent between the Sol System Frontier Garrison and Coalition Command over the duration of their posting. I expected it to be thin, a few check-ins, maybe a handful of status reports before the posting wound down naturally. The log was 412 pages long. I did not read all 412 pages that Tuesday, but I read enough. The first section of the log covered the early years of the posting, and the transmissions there were businesslike and confident. The humans reported regularly. They described their activities in precise, organized language. They logged patrol routes. They noted the locations of debris fields and navigation hazards. They mentioned, almost in passing, first contact with a small nomadic species in the corridor that they called the Dravathi, and described initial diplomatic exchanges with careful detail. They requested updated star charts. They asked for clarification on their chain of command. They asked when their resupply vessel would arrive. The resupply vessel never arrived. I found the first unanswered message 30 pages into the log. It was a routine status report, identical in format to the previous ones, but at the bottom there was a short additional note. No response received to previous 4 transmissions. Awaiting acknowledgement. Please confirm frequency is active. The note was professional. There was no frustration in it, no alarm. Just the careful language of people who assumed the problem was technical and temporary. 40 pages later, the tone had shifted slightly, not dramatically. The humans were not people who expressed alarm dramatically, at least not in their official communications. But the notes at the bottom of each transmission had grown longer. They had begun keeping count. No response received to transmissions 41 through 63. They had tried alternate frequencies. They had recalibrated their equipment. They had sent a small probe toward the nearest known relay station and logged that the probe returned without finding an active relay. The frequency, it turned out, had been rotated out of use by Coalition Command without notification. The humans had no way of knowing that. They only knew that their radio was working, and no one was answering. They kept transmitting anyway. That is the part that stayed with me. That is the part I could not set aside after I closed the file and put it back in its gray sleeve. They had no confirmation that anyone was receiving their signals. They had no evidence that the coalition was still monitoring the frequency. They had nothing but a charter signed 800 years ago that said, "This is your mission, this is your post, this is where you belong." And they kept transmitting. Every 3 months, a new status report. Every 3 months, the same careful professional language, the same organized format, the same brief note at the bottom. No response received. Continuing mission. For 119 years, they transmitted into silence. I set the file down and looked out my window at the 3 moons. The orbital station was visible, a soft, bright point of light in the dark. The Coalition Council met there every cycle to discuss the important business of the galaxy. Trade agreements, border negotiations, diplomatic crises. 800 years ago, in one of those meetings, or perhaps in a quiet hallway afterward, someone had made a decision. Maybe it was a deliberate decision. Maybe it was just a failure of attention. Maybe the file had simply been passed from desk to desk until it ended up in a gray sleeve in a dormant archive, and no one had ever thought to ask, what happened to the people we sent to the Keth Voran corridor? No one had asked, and so I was the first one to ask, 847 years too late. I looked at the data chip that had come with the file. It was sealed with the old encryption tag, but the Bureau's systems could open anything up to 1,000 cycles old. I plugged it into my terminal and ran the decryption. The chip contained a second communication log, not the official one I had already read, but a secondary archive, unofficial, the kind of record that gets kept not because regulations require it, but because people need somewhere to put the things they cannot say in official reports. The first entry was dated 400 cycles into the posting. The writer identified herself only as CO, third generation. Her name was not in the file, but I know it now. I found it later. Her name was Ada Okafor, and she was the commanding officer of the Keth Voran garrison at that time, the great-great-grandmother of the woman I would eventually meet across a diplomatic table. She wrote simply, "Official log continues as required. Personal note for the archive. We have not heard from the coalition in 140 years. The Garrison Council met today and voted unanimously to continue the mission. There was some debate, but in the end, the decision was easy. The Dravathi needed us 6 months ago when the border raiders came through. The Sulcan contacted us last week about a disease moving through their hive cluster. The Morven Shapers asked us to help map their outer moons because their own instruments are not good enough yet. These people need us. The Coalition assigned us here to protect this corridor. Whether the Coalition remembers that or not, we remember it. I read that entry 3 times. Then I picked up my communicator and called the Director of External Affairs. She was not pleased to be interrupted. She asked me to submit a formal inquiry through the standard channels. I told her I did not think the standard channels were appropriate in this case. She asked me why. I told her I had found a file, a dormant membership file, and that the species in question had been transmitting status reports into a dead frequency for over a century before the relays failed, and that based on what I was reading, they had not stopped doing their job even after that. There was a long silence on the line. Then she asked me to come to her office. I took the gray-sleeved file with me. I also took the data chip, and as I rode the lift down from the 43rd floor, I found myself thinking about what it means to be forgotten. Not the dramatic kind of forgotten, the kind where someone leaves you behind in a crisis, or turns away in anger. The quiet kind. The administrative kind. The kind where you are not abandoned with any intent. You are simply filed, placed in a sleeve, marked dormant, left for someone else to deal with, and that someone else never comes. I thought about the humans transmitting into silence for 119 years. I thought about Ada Okafor writing in a private archive because she needed somewhere to put the truth that the official log had no room for. I thought about the charter, and the underlined sentence, and the handwritten note on a small paper card in faded ink. Follow-up pending. No one had followed up. Not for 847 years. I had found the file on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, the galaxy would begin to understand what that meant. The Director of External Affairs sat across from me in her large, well-lit office, and I watched her face as she read the log. She is a careful woman. She does not show emotion easily, but her hands went very still about halfway through the communication log, and she did not move them again for a long time. When she finished, she set the documents on her desk and looked at me. She asked me how confident I was in the accuracy of the file. I told her I was completely confident. The documents were original. The encryption tags were authentic. The transmission logs matched known coalition frequency records from the period. There was no question that the file was real. She asked me if anyone else had seen it. I told her no, just me, and now her. She was quiet for another long moment. Then she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "The question is not whether this happened. The question is what we do about it now." I nodded. That was the right way to frame it. What do we do now? But even as I agreed with her, another question was moving through my mind. The question I had not said out loud to anyone yet. The question that the 412-page communication log, and the secondary archive, and Ada Okafor's quiet, dignified entry had been building toward since I first opened that gray sleeve. We had forgotten them. We had left them in the outer rim with a broken radio and a charter, and a posting at the end of nowhere. And they had continued the mission. For 847 years, they had continued the mission. Which meant they were still out there. And at some point, they were going to run out of patience. Or worse, from the Coalition's perspective, they were not going to run out of patience at all. They were simply going to show up, calm, organized, 8 centuries of receipts in their hands. And they were going to ask, in that careful professional language I had been reading all morning, for the thing they had been owed since the beginning. I looked at the Director of External Affairs. She looked at me. Neither of us said it out loud, but we were both thinking the same thing. Someone needed to make contact. Before they did. I did not sleep well that night. I have slept poorly on and off for the 3 years since then, and I believe, if I am being honest with myself, that it has less to do with the workload of the review office than with the specific quality of the discomfort that comes from having read those transmission logs. The kind of discomfort that does not go away when you close the file, because it has attached itself to your understanding of how things work, and cannot be unfastened. The discomfort is this. The mechanism that produced the neglect was not unusual. It was not a special failure. It was the ordinary functioning of a large institution that had too many concerns to give full attention to a posting it had deemed low priority. Every large institution does this. Every large institution has gray sleeves in dormant archives with handwritten notes that say follow-up pending on paper cards in faded ink. The specific outcome in the Kethvoran corridor was unusual because of the humans who were there, because they did not dissolve or withdraw or fall apart in the silence, but instead built something extraordinary out of the materials they had been given and the mission they had accepted. But the mechanism that produced the silence was completely ordinary. That is the uncomfortable thing to carry, not the exceptional response, the ordinary cause. I went back to the archive the morning after I called Sova Marath. I sat at my desk and looked at the gray sleeve on the edge of my workspace, and then I looked at the rest of my inbox. There were 47 other items waiting for attention, 47 other files, reports, flagged documents, pending reviews. Ordinary workday material. I went through each one. I gave each one proper attention, the kind I had given the Sol System file when I decided not to slide it back into the dormant category and move on. Not extraordinary attention. Just the ordinary care of someone who understands that the things in front of them are real, that they represent real people and real situations, and that the practice of filing something away without reading it is a practice with consequences that compound across time. It took me most of the day to work through the 47 items. 3 of them needed immediate follow-up. I made the calls that afternoon. None of those 3 produced anything close to what I found in the Kethvoran corridor. 2 were routine, a surveying team that needed updated navigational data, and a minor species contact post that had a communications backlog. The third was more interesting, a small research station on the outer rim whose funding authorization had lapsed due to a budget reclassification 3 cycles back, leaving 6 researchers in a situation where they were doing excellent work with no clear authorization or support pathway. It took me 4 weeks to untangle the paperwork and restore their status. They sent a brief acknowledgement when the resolution came through, professional and efficient. The acknowledgement said, "Authorization confirmed. Thank you for the follow-up. We had begun to wonder." 6 researchers, 3 cycles without a response. Already beginning to form the question of whether anyone at the center of things was paying attention. I thought about what 3 cycles of that feeling becomes over 300 cycles, over 800 years. I put that thought somewhere careful and kept working. The gray sleeve stayed on the corner of my desk until the contact mission departed. Then I filed it properly, in the active section, under Sol System, status updated, follow-up complete, and it became part of the record it deserved to be. The paper card with the handwritten note, I kept. I have it still, in a small frame beside my terminal, not as a reminder of failure, as a reminder of what the beginning of the correction looked like. A Tuesday, an open file, a phone call. That is how 800 years end, not with great declarations, with someone at a desk deciding to read the thing in front of them and then making the call. The director's name was Sova Marath. She had been in external affairs for 30 cycles, and in that time she had managed 17 first contact situations, 4 border disputes that nearly became wars, and 1 incident involving a species that communicated exclusively through controlled bioluminescence and had accidentally triggered a defense alert by waving hello. She was not easily rattled. I had never seen her look rattled. She looked rattled now. She called in 2 junior staff members and instructed them to prepare a priority search of the Coalition's historical communication archives. She wanted every transmission logged as outbound to the Kethvoran sector over the past 800 cycles, cross-referenced with any corresponding inbound signals. She gave them 4 hours to produce a preliminary report. They came back in 3. The results were not reassuring. The outbound transmissions numbered in the dozens, mostly routine galactic survey notices, navigational updates, and 2 administrative circulars about membership reclassification that had been sent out in bulk to all registered frontier postings. None of them had been sent specifically to the Sol System garrison. None had been answered. The inbound side was where it got genuinely difficult to read. There were signals, hundreds of them, archived automatically by the receiving system and routed to a processing queue that had, at some point in the previous 300 cycles, been discontinued as part of a bureau efficiency review. The signals had not been deleted. They had simply been moved, placed in a lower priority storage index that no longer connected to any active monitoring system. Filed, in other words, without anyone reading them. I requested access to the storage index. It took about 2 hours to get authorization, because the relevant permissions had changed hands so many times over the centuries that no single current staff member was clearly responsible for the archive. In the end, Sova Marath used an emergency director's override, and we got in. What we found was methodical. That is the only word for it. The humans had been transmitting every 90 days, without exception, from the moment they arrived at the Kethvoran posting until approximately 300 cycles ago, when the last known relay station in the corridor was destroyed in a debris field event. After the relay failure, the signals simply could not reach Coalition space any longer, but before that, they had sent over 3,000 individual transmissions. Every single one was formatted identically: header, date, posting identification, commanding officer signature, body of report, end signature. Like clockwork. Like the kind of people who do something not because it is noticed or rewarded, but because they decided it was what you do. Sova Marath read through a sampling of the reports in silence. I watched her face move through several expressions she did not know she was showing. Toward the end, when she reached a transmission from about 500 cycles ago, she stopped and read one paragraph out loud. She did not explain why she chose that one. She just read it. The report was from a commanding officer who identified himself as Colonel Declan Murrow, 4th-generation garrison-born. The paragraph she read described a confrontation with a fleet of unmarked vessels that had entered the Kethvoran corridor from the border, with what had once been Veth supremacy territory. The unmarked fleet had been attempting to establish a base on a Dravathi-inhabited asteroid cluster. The garrison had intervened. The confrontation had lasted 11 days. The unmarked fleet had withdrawn. The Dravathi settlement had not been harmed. The report noted that one garrison vessel had sustained significant structural damage, and that 3 crew members had been injured, 2 seriously. It then stated, "No casualties among the Dravathi population. Mission objective achieved. Awaiting medical resupply per standing request." The medical resupply request had been submitted, according to the log, 4 years earlier. Sova Marath set the report down. She did not say anything for almost a full minute. Then she said, "We need to know who is out there now. Not who they were, who they are." That was the question no one in the Bureau had thought to ask in 800 years, and answering it required us to accept something uncomfortable. We did not know. We had no current intelligence on the Sol System frontier garrison whatsoever. The last confirmed data we held was from the initial membership application, a population of approximately 8 billion on one world, early-stage space travel, ships capable of inner-system navigation, and limited outer-system transit. That data was ancient. Whatever the humans had become in the intervening centuries was unknown to us entirely. It was Sova Marath who first said what we were both beginning to understand. She said it quietly, looking at the communication logs spread across her desk. They did not wait for us. They could not wait for us. They had no support, and no contact, and responsibilities they had voluntarily taken on. So they learned to handle everything themselves. That sounds obvious when you say it. It is the kind of thing that seems self-evident after the fact. But in that moment, sitting in that office, looking at 800 years of transmissions sent to a dead receiver, the full weight of what it meant had not yet hit me. I was still thinking of the humans as the species in the file. Small, new, asking politely for a chance to contribute. I stopped thinking of them that way about an hour later, when one of the junior staff members came in carrying a secondary report. He was a young Solvan, fresh out of his training cycle, and his secondary color patches, the ones that shift with emotion in Solvan physiology, were cycling rapidly between gray and the pale blue that indicates something between confusion and alarm. He set the report on the desk without speaking. Sova Marath picked it up. It was a cross-reference. One of her staff had thought to check the Coalition's Navigational Hazard Registry, a system used by commercial shipping and exploration vessels to flag regions of space as potentially dangerous. and had run the Keth Voran sector through it. The corridor had been flagged numerous times over the past several centuries, and the flag notes were informative. The first flags were from traders who had attempted to pass through the corridor and been intercepted by vessels they described as unregistered and heavily armed, crewed by species unknown. The traders had been escorted back the way they came without incident, and the vessels had identified themselves as the Keth Voran Defense Force, operating under Coalition Charter, and had stated that passage through the corridor required prior clearance. Coalition Charter. 800 years after the charter was issued, they were still citing it. The later flags were different in character. As the cycles passed, the Keth Voran corridor's reputation in the shipping registries shifted. The early flags' warning of interception gave way to later notes that described the corridor as well-patrolled and safe for authorized transit. Then, more recently, notes about the corridor's major waypoint stations, places where traders could stop for water, fuel, and supplies. The stations were listed without coordinates in any Coalition database, because the Coalition had never known they existed, but they appeared in the navigational notes of dozens of traders who had passed through the corridor over the last 200 cycles. Stations, plural. Sova Marath put the report down and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. It was not exactly fear. It was the look of someone who has just understood that they have been thinking about a problem at the wrong scale. They built infrastructure, she said. I nodded. In a corridor we thought was empty. I nodded again. She stood up and walked to her window, which faced west, toward the capital's old district. She stood there for a moment, with her back to me. Then she said, without turning around, "How many? Do we have any estimate?" I told her I did not have a precise count. Based on the transmission logs, the garrison had grown significantly over the centuries. The early reports listed crew counts in the hundreds. Later reports mentioned crew rotations and population transfers in numbers that suggested something much larger. I told her that based on the trajectory of growth documented in the logs, my rough estimate was that the human presence in the Keth Voran corridor could number in the millions. She turned around. "Millions," she said. "Born there," I said. "Most of them have never seen Earth." That was the part that changed the texture of the conversation entirely. These were not humans from Earth, who had gone out on a frontier posting and been stranded. The current generation, the generation alive right now, out in the corridor, were people who had been born in that space. It was their home. It was the only home they had ever known. They had grown up on stations their grandparents built, learning how to maintain equipment their great-grandparents had repaired by hand, because there was no one to send replacements. They had grown up hearing the stories of the transmissions sent into silence, of the resupply ships that never came, of the charter that had been issued by a government many of them had never seen. They were not the forgotten. They were the children of the forgotten, and they had made something out of what they had been left with. Sova Marath sat back down. She opened the navigational hazard registry notes again and read through them more carefully. I watched her stop at a particular entry from approximately 60 cycles ago. A trader ship, a small Drellin commercial freighter, had noted the following: Keth Voran Transit. Cleared through waypoint station designated KV-7 by KVDF patrol vessel. Patrol vessel was a heavy cruiser class, well-maintained, armed configuration. Crew was human, mixed generation. Commander introduced herself as Lieutenant Petra Calloway, KVDF 7th Patrol Division. She was polite and professional. She asked us to report to Coalition Command that the garrison was still active and awaiting contact. She said, to quote her directly, "We are here, we are well, and we are ready to discuss our membership status whenever the Coalition is ready to have that conversation." 60 cycles ago, a lieutenant on a patrol vessel had sent a message through a passing trader ship because that was the only relay available to her, and she had asked the trader to deliver it to Coalition Command. The trader had filed it in the Navigational Hazard Registry under miscellaneous notes. Nobody at the Coalition had ever read it. Sova Marath closed the registry file. She looked at me with the expression she wears when she has made a decision and is preparing to act on it. "I am going to propose a contact mission to the Director General," she said. "We need to reach out to whatever command structure they have out there. Not as a negotiation, not as a formal diplomatic approach. Just contact. Acknowledge them. Tell them we know they are there." I agreed. It was the right first step. But even as I agreed, Something else was working its way through my thinking. Something that the trader's report had snagged on when I read it, the lieutenant's words, polite and professional, ready to discuss membership status whenever the coalition is ready. 60 cycles ago, a human lieutenant on a patrol vessel had anticipated being found eventually. She had planned for it. She had used a passing trader as a message carrier, knowing it might not work, knowing the message might never arrive. She had done it anyway, because that was the available option, and so that was the option she used. I thought about what that implied. Not just for that one lieutenant, but for a garrison that had been operating in isolation for centuries. They had not lost discipline. They had not collapsed into the kind of organizational chaos that would be understandable, even predictable, after generations of abandonment. They had maintained their structure, maintained their mission, maintained their readiness, and apparently also maintained, across all of it, a calm and patient expectation that contact would eventually be re-established. They had planned for this moment. For the moment when someone would finally notice the gray-tagged file and make the call. I left Sova Marath's office and took the long way back to the archive, walking through the building's open central corridor, where the windows faced east, and you could see the city spreading out below in the morning light. I thought about Ada Okafor, writing in a private archive 400 cycles ago, not knowing if anyone would ever read it. I thought about Declan Murrow, writing a status report about an 11-day confrontation with no expectation of response. I thought about Lieutenant Petra Calloway, giving a message to a Draylen trader and watching the ship disappear into the dark. And I thought about the data chip, and the hundreds of reports archived in a dead storage index, and the paper card with faded handwriting that said, "Follow-up pending." The galaxy had 800 years of catching up to do, and the humans, it seemed, had been ready and waiting for the conversation for quite some time. The only question left was what we would find when we went to have it. The Director General's name was Orath Vel, and he was the most powerful administrator in the coalition. He had held the position for 12 cycles, which was considered a long tenure. He was calm under pressure. He was politically careful. He was the kind of leader who asked for 4 separate reports before making any decision of consequence. He asked for 0 reports before approving the contact mission. Sova Marath told me this the following morning when I arrived at the bureau. She said she had laid out the situation in precise terms, given him the key documents, and he had sat quietly for about 2 minutes, and then authorized the mission without asking a single question. She said she found that slightly more alarming than if he had demanded those 4 reports. I understood what she meant. When someone who always asks questions stops asking them, it usually means the situation is clear enough that questions feel irrelevant. Orath Vel had looked at 800 years of neglect, and at least one delivered message that had been filed under miscellaneous, and concluded that the time for studying the problem was over. The contact vessel assigned to the mission was a coalition diplomatic courier, fast and lightly built, designed for quick transit and first impression situations, where how you arrive matters as much as what you say when you get there. Its captain was a Sulvan named Vel Terrace, experienced and quietly competent. The diplomatic team aboard would be small: Sova Marath herself, 2 support staff, a translation specialist, and me, because I was the one who had opened the file, and because Sova Marath believed, correctly, that I had spent enough hours reading those transmission logs to understand the humans in a way that briefing documents could not convey. The journey to the Kethvoran corridor took 11 days at standard transit speed. On the second day, we received a navigational advisory from the corridor's outer boundary. It was automated. It identified itself as broadcast by the Kethvoran Defense Force and advised all vessels entering the corridor to state their purpose and credentials on a specific frequency. The frequency was not one listed in any coalition directory. It was one the garrison had apparently established themselves, sometime in the centuries when the coalition's own frequencies went dark. Captain Vel Terrace looked at me when the advisory came in. I told him to transmit on the given frequency, to state that we were a coalition diplomatic vessel, carrying a formal delegation, to say we were coming in peace and asking for a meeting. He did exactly that. The response came back in 4 minutes. Not hours, not days, 4 minutes, which meant someone had been monitoring that frequency continuously and was prepared for this kind of contact. The response was a human voice, male, with an accent that bore only faint resemblance to any Earth dialect I had studied. It was something new. 800 years of a language evolving in isolation, picking up rhythms and sounds from the three species they had lived alongside. It was still recognizably English, but it had become something else as well, something that belonged specifically to the corridor. The voice said, "Coalition Diplomatic Vessel. This is KVDF Waypoint Station 7 Communications. Your transmission is received. We are alerting Fleet Command and the Garrison Council. You will be met at the corridor boundary by a KVDF escort. Please maintain current heading and do not alter course without contacting us first. We want this to go smoothly. We have been waiting a long time for this conversation." That last sentence. The tone of it. Not angry, not cold, just honest. The way someone speaks when they have rehearsed a moment so many times in their head that when it finally comes, they do not need to perform anything. They just say what is true. We maintained our heading. On the 5th day, the escort arrived. The escort that met us at the corridor boundary was not what any of us had expected. I say that knowing that none of us had formed a precise expectation. We had the old membership file. We had centuries-old shipbuilding specs from Earth. We had the navigational hazard reports from traders who had described heavy cruisers and patrol vessels. We had tried to prepare ourselves for the possibility that what we would find would be significantly more developed than our records suggested. We were not prepared. There were 6 ships. They came out of the dark at the boundary marker in a formation so precise it looked choreographed, 2 at the front, 2 flanking, 2 behind, arranged around our much smaller diplomatic courier, like a careful hand cupped around something fragile. Captain Velteris pulled up the sensor readings, and for a moment, nobody on the bridge said anything at all. The 6 ships were not cruisers. They were not destroyers. They were not anything in our classification system, which meant our computer spent several seconds trying to match them to known configurations before returning an error, and simply logging them as unclassified, large. The smallest of the 6 was approximately twice the mass of a standard coalition heavy cruiser. The largest, the one that positioned itself directly ahead of us, slightly turned so its full profile was visible, was in a category I could not quickly find language for. It was enormous. Dark-hulled in the way that metal gets after centuries of use and repair. A color that is not quite black, but is what you get when black has been exposed to cosmic radiation, and welded over, and painted, and worn, and lived in for so long, that the original color is somewhere underneath everything else. And along the side of that ship, running in rows along the hull plating near the bow, were marks. I had read about them in the navigational reports. Tallies, groups of 5, the way a person marks time when they are keeping count without paper. They were not small decorative elements. They were large enough to be visible on our sensor displays. Hundreds of them, maybe more. Captain Velteris said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Those are battle records." No one disagreed with him. The communication frequency opened without us initiating it. The voice that came through was different from the one at the waypoint station. Female this time. Older, from the texture of it. And there was something in the accent that carried a quality I could only call weight, not heaviness. Weight. The kind that comes from saying things you have thought about for a very long time. She said, "Coalition Diplomatic Vessel. This is Fleet Admiral Saren Okafor Vasquez, of the Keth Voran Defense Force, commanding KVDF Dreadnought Perseverance. You are in our corridor. And we are going to take care of you. Please follow our escort to Waypoint Station 9, where the Garrison Council is assembled and waiting. We have a great deal to discuss." Sova Marath leaned forward and opened the channel on our end. She introduced herself, her title, and the purpose of our mission. She said the Coalition was deeply glad to have re-established contact. She used careful diplomatic language, the kind that acknowledges a situation without making specific commitments too early. The Fleet Admiral listened. There was a pause when Sova Marath finished. Then the Admiral said, "That's good to hear. We will continue this conversation at the station. Follow the escort, please." Nothing more. No expression of relief. No statement about how long they had been waiting. Just, "Follow the escort, please." That restraint said more than any speech would have. We followed. Waypoint Station 9 was a revelation. I had imagined something functional, a basic structure, built out of necessity rather than any architectural consideration, the kind of place you build when you are working with limited materials and no external support. What we arrived at was not that. The station was large, not enormous by the standard of major coalition installations, but large in the way that things become large when people keep adding to them across generations, with the understanding that what they are building is permanent. It had clearly begun as something much smaller. You could see the original structure in the center, a cylindrical core that was older than everything around it, and bore that same dark-weathered quality as the ship's hulls. Around that original core, over the course of centuries, sections had been added, extended, modified, expanded outward and upward, in rings of construction that marked the generations the way rings mark the growth of a tree. The outermost sections were new, newer than anything else, and built with a sophistication that the older sections did not have, because the people who built them had had access to 800 years of accumulated technical knowledge and the particular kind of engineering creativity that develops when you cannot order replacement parts and must solve every problem yourself. There was a population living on this station. I understood that in a different way when we docked and walked out into the main corridor. It was not a military installation with civilian support. It was a place where people lived. There were common areas with benches and something that served as vegetation, plants adapted for the station environment, green and a color I had no name for, growing in arranged spaces along the corridors. There were posted notices on the walls, handwritten and printed, in a mix of English and two other languages I recognized as Dravathi and a simplified form of the Sulcan hive script. There were children. I had not expected children. I do not know why. The logic was obvious. These people had been here for 800 years, which meant generations, which meant births and lives and growth. Of course there were children. But reading about a population in a document and walking past a group of children who look up at you with the frank, direct curiosity that children always have, those are different experiences. One of the children, a girl of perhaps 7 or 8 years by human count, looked at me with enormous dark eyes and then looked at the blue Drellin diplomatic sash I was wearing. She pointed at it and said something in that corridor English accent, too fast for me to follow. The adult with her, a young man who might have been her father, touched her shoulder gently and said something back, and she nodded and kept looking at me as we passed. He caught my eye. He gave me a small nod, not unfriendly, just acknowledging, the look of someone who has been told that today is a significant day and is choosing to observe it with dignity. The council chamber was at the center of the station's original core. It was a round room, low-ceilinged, with a table in the middle, that was clearly old, very old, the kind of old that a table gets when it has been in the same place for centuries and had too much history happen around it to be replaced. Around the table sat 9 people, humans of varying ages, wearing clothes that were neither uniforms nor civilian dress but something between the two, functional, marked with insignia that I would later learn to read, worn with the ease of people who have dressed this way their entire lives. Fleet Admiral Saren Okafor Vasquez sat at the head of the table. I recognized her from the voice on the communication channel, or rather, I recognized the quality she had projected through that voice. She was in her late 50s by human count, lean and composed, with short silver hair and the particular stillness of someone who has spent decades making decisions and has learned to be calm when calmness is needed. She did not stand when we entered. She waited. She watched us find our seats. When we were settled, she looked at Sova Marath. "Thank you for coming," she said. And then, without any pause, without any warm-up, "We would like to understand what happened." Sova Marath had prepared for this. She had a statement ready, an explanation that covered the communications lapse, the administrative restructuring, the frequency rotation, the relay failures. It was a thorough and carefully worded explanation that covered every technical reason for why contact had been interrupted. The Admiral listened to all of it. When Sova Marath finished, there was a moment of quiet around the table. Then one of the council members, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s named Callum Baird, who held the title of Garrison Logistics Director, leaned forward slightly and said, "When did the coalition decide our frequency was no longer active?" Sova Marath hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Approximately 150 cycles after your posting commenced. It was part of an administrative..." 150 cycles, Callum Baird repeated. He said it the way you repeat something when you want to make sure you heard it correctly. "We were transmitting for 119 years before that." Without response. "Yes. That is correct. So the Coalition received our transmissions for 119 years and did not respond, and then deactivated our frequency, without notification. It was not a question. It was a sequence of facts being placed on a table, carefully, one after another. The room was very quiet. The Admiral had not moved during this exchange. Now she spoke again. We are not here to assign blame. I want to be clear about that. The Garrison Council voted before this meeting, and we are agreed. We are not here to express anger. We are here to discuss our status and our future relationship with the Coalition. We have a mission we were assigned. We have been fulfilling it. We intend to continue fulfilling it. What we need is clarity about where we stand. Sova Marath said she understood. The Admiral said, "Good. Then let us begin with a simple question. Does the Coalition consider the Sol System Frontier Garrison to be currently active members?" I was taking notes. I was supposed to be taking notes the whole time. I had stopped when the Admiral first spoke, and had not started again until this moment. I noted the question. I noted the silence that followed it. I noted that Sova Marath, for the first time in the session, looked briefly at me, rather than at the Admiral. I did not have an answer to give her. The file had listed them as dormant, but dormant, as I had learned in the past week, was a word that the people in this room had never applied to themselves. The Admiral waited. She was good at waiting. 8 centuries of waiting was in the room with us, patient as stone. Sova Marath recovered quickly. She is excellent at recovering quickly. It is, in many ways, the most important skill in her profession. She told the Admiral that the Coalition's current position was that the Sol system posting remained a valid and active charter, and that the question of precise membership classification was exactly the kind of thing the upcoming discussions would address. She said it smoothly, with no visible hesitation. The Admiral nodded. She did not look like someone who had been reassured. She looked like someone who had received an answer that told her something useful, though not necessarily the thing the answer was trying to convey. The session broke after 2 hours for a meal interval. The Garrison Council moved to a smaller adjoining room, and Sova Marath's team regrouped in the corridor outside. I used the break to walk. The station's original core section had corridors that curved in a long, slow arc, following the cylindrical structure of the original build, and if you walked the full circuit, you could see the progression of the station's history simply by watching how the walls changed. Near the council chamber, the original construction was visible. An older alloy, different in color and texture from anything used in modern construction, showing the marks of hand finishing, because the early settlers had not yet built the automated fabrication systems that later generations would develop. Further along, the walls transitioned, new materials, more efficient engineering, and all along, at regular intervals, there were plaques, mounted at eye height, some metal, some ceramic, some a material I could not identify. Each one bore a name and a date. Not death notices, I realized after a moment. Service records. The people who had commanded the garrison, generation by generation. The officers who had filed the reports. The engineers who had built the stations. The doctors who had kept the population healthy without resupply ships. The teachers who had maintained the educational system so that knowledge did not decay. There were hundreds of plaques, hundreds of named individuals, spanning 8 centuries. Some of the names were recognizable as English in origin. Some had blended with sounds from Dravathi and Sulcan languages. All of them were human, born here or brought here, living and working in a space that no one outside the corridor knew existed. Near the end of the circuit, I stopped at one plaque that was different from the others. It was older than almost everything around it, placed on the original alloy wall, and the lettering was done by hand in a style that suggested it had been made without fabrication equipment. The name on it was Ada Okafor. Below the name was a title, Commanding Officer, Keth Voran Garrison, 3rd Generation, and below the title, a single line of text. It read, "She kept the mission." I stood there for a long time, reading those 4 words. The author of those private archive entries, the woman who had written, 400 cycles ago, "These people need us." The mission was assigned. Whether the Coalition remembers or not, we remember. She had been memorialized on the wall of the station where her great-granddaughter now sat as Fleet Admiral, and the thing they had chosen to say about her was not her rank, or her years of service, or the specific battles she had fought. It was that she had kept the mission. That was the value system. That was the thing the corridor culture had built itself around, across 800 years and 9 million people. The mission was the mission. You kept it, not because you were being watched, not because anyone was checking, because it was yours and you had said you would. I went back to the council session with a different understanding of who I was sitting across from. The afternoon session was more substantive. The Garrison Council had prepared documentation, meticulous, organized, cross-reference documentation that covered 800 years of frontier activity, population records, construction logs, engagement records, diplomatic agreements with the Dravathi, the Sulcan, and the Morven Shapers, resource inventories, medical records, educational curricula, everything they had done and built and protected, catalogued with the obsessive completeness of people who had long understood that their records might someday need to speak for them. One of the council members, a woman named Nora Ashby, who held the title of Historical Keeper, a role, she explained, that had been created in the garrison's second generation specifically to ensure records were maintained, set a data drive on the table. She said it contained the complete archive, every transmission they had ever sent, every log entry, every personal note from every commanding officer across the centuries. She slid it across the table to me, because I was the archivist. I picked it up. It was warm from her hand. She looked at me when I took it. She had gray eyes and a directness in her expression that reminded me of something, and it took me a moment to identify what. It was the directness of someone who has nothing to hide and knows it. The particular confidence of complete transparency. She said, "We have kept better records of our time on this frontier than the Coalition has kept of us. I expect you will find that when you review them." It was not said with pride. It was not said with bitterness. It was simply an observation about what was true. She was right. I found that when I reviewed them. The afternoon session ended with the Admiral making 3 clear, unambiguous statements of position. The garrison would continue to operate as it had. The 3 protected species, the Dravathi, the Sulcan, and the Morven Shapers, fell under the garrison's mutual defense agreements, and those agreements would be honored regardless of what happened in negotiations. And the garrison was prepared to discuss its formal status with the Coalition, but it would not accept a reclassification that diminished what it had built or ignored what it had done. The statements were delivered the way the Admiral delivered everything, calm, precise, without drama, the kind of statements that do not need to be backed by threats because the reality behind them is already obvious to everyone in the room. We flew back to the diplomatic courier that evening, through a corridor that was more populated than any Outer Rim region had any right to be. With stations and routes and mapped systems and a web of relationships the Coalition had known nothing about until a week ago. I sat in my small cabin and held the data drive and tried to organize my thoughts well enough to begin the first contact report. I ended up staring at the wall for an hour instead. Sova Marath came to find me. She sat down across from me in the cabin's other chair, which left almost no space between us, and she said, "Write what you saw. Write exactly what you saw." I asked her what she was going to recommend to the Director General. She said, "I'm going to recommend we give them everything they ask for, not as a concession, as a correction." I asked her if she thought the Council would agree. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think the Council is going to look at that data drive. I think they're going to look at 800 years of service records and 3 alien species that are alive and stable because of a garrison we forgot existed. And I think the Council is going to understand that the question is not whether we can afford to give them what they ask for. The question is whether we can afford the kind of institution we become if we don't." She was right about that too. I opened my recording device and began the report. The first contact report landed on Orithvel's desk within 12 hours of our return to Thesara Prime. By the end of that day, copies had reached every department head in the Coalition's administrative structure. By the end of the following day, it was in front of the Security Council. By the end of the day after that, the news had reached the general population through the Bureau's public record release system, which is required by Coalition law to publish any official contact event within 72 hours of its classification. The galaxy, as I believe I mentioned, did not take this calmly. I am going to be careful about how I describe the reaction, because a great deal of what happened in those first weeks was embarrassing for a number of powerful parties, and some of those parties are still powerful, and I have learned in my career that embarrassment remembered is a slow and reliable way to make enemies. So I will say this, the reaction was significant. It was widespread, and it covered a remarkable range of emotional registers, from stunned disbelief to something that looked uncomfortably like guilt, with a large middle section that can only be described as political panic. The Security Council called an emergency session within 48 hours of the report's publication. The session lasted 11 hours and produced, at its conclusion, a brief official statement saying that the coalition was actively engaging with the newly re-established Sol System frontier posting, and that further announcements would follow as discussions progressed. This was the kind of statement that says nothing while implying a great deal, and the population of 17 member worlds reading it drew their own conclusions accordingly. Sova Marath and I were called to testify before the council on the third day. We sat in the council chamber, a large, formal room designed to convey institutional authority, with high ceilings and ranked seating for the representatives of every member species. And for 3 hours, we described what we had seen. I had been in that chamber before, for routine archival presentations. I had never felt in any previous visit the particular quality of attention that the council gave us that morning. They were listening the way you listen, when you understand that what you are hearing is going to require you to change something. The most difficult part of the testimony came when Representative Veth Sarath of the Sulvan Collective asked me to describe the station, not the fleet, not the diplomatic session, the station, the place itself, the corridors and the plaques and the plants growing along the walls, and the child who had pointed at my sash with enormous dark eyes. I described it as accurately as I could. I described the Ada Okafor plaque. I described what it said. She kept the mission. The representative listened without speaking. Then she asked me one question. She said, "In your professional assessment, as someone who has spent 17 cycles working with historical records, how would you characterize the quality of the garrison's record-keeping over the 800-year period?" I told her it was the most thorough and consistent record-keeping I had encountered in my career. I told her that the garrison had maintained detailed logs of every significant event, every personnel change, every resource expenditure, every diplomatic interaction, and every transmission sent to Coalition Command, across 8 centuries, without a single unexplained gap in the archive. I told her that they had done this without any external requirement or oversight, in complete isolation, simply because they believed records should be kept. Representative Veth Sarath nodded very slowly. Then she said, "And how would you characterize the quality of the Coalition's record-keeping regarding the Sol system posting over the same period?" I told her the truth. I told her that the Coalition's file on the Sol system posting consisted of the original application, the membership response, the charter, the deactivated frequency log, and a paper card with a handwritten note that said, "Follow-up pending." I told her that every transmission the garrison had sent in the first 119 years of radio contact had been automatically archived in a storage index that was subsequently disconnected from any active monitoring system and not reviewed until I accessed it the previous week. I told her that a trader's message from 60 cycles ago, specifically requesting Coalition contact, had been filed under miscellaneous in the Navigational Hazard Registry. The chamber was very quiet. Representative Veth Sarath said, "Thank you. That is all I needed to know." It was the way she said it, like the last piece of something had just clicked into place. And what had clicked into place, I understood, was not just the facts of what had happened, but the full moral dimension of it. The Coalition had not simply made an administrative error. The Coalition had maintained a comfortable fiction about a frontier posting it had no intention of supporting, had allowed that fiction to persist for nearly 9 centuries, and had filed the evidence of its own neglect in a storage index where it would never have to be confronted. And on the other side of that neglect, 9 million people had been born into the silence. The negotiating team was assembled within a week. Sova Marath led it. I was included as the archival specialist, with the specific role of verifying documentation and maintaining the official record of every session. The garrison sent its team from the corridor, the Admiral, Callum Baird, Nora Ashby, and 4 other council members whose names I now know as well as my own. They came to Thesara Prime for the negotiations, which was a significant logistical undertaking given that most of them had never left the corridor in their lives. The Admiral had visited Earth twice, which made her among the most widely traveled members of the garrison. They arrived on a KVDF vessel, Not the Perseverance, which was too large for the Thesara orbital docking infrastructure, but a mid-weight cruiser they called the Long Memory, which was old enough to bear the same weathered dark hull quality as the larger ships, but maneuverable enough to dock at the station. The sight of it entering orbit was broadcast on the public network, and I understand that a significant portion of the Coalition's population watched the feed live. I was at the docking terminal when the garrison delegation disembarked. I had been asked to meet them as the primary liaison for the archival record. What I had not anticipated was the crowd. The terminal was not open to the public, but the station's administrative staff had found reasons to be present, at consoles, in corridors, pausing on maintenance walkways to watch. The garrison team came down the docking corridor in a group, and the crowd that watched them was quiet. Not the silence of disapproval. The silence of something larger than that. The silence of people who were understanding, in real time, the weight of what their institution had done, and seeing in the faces of the garrison delegation the full consequence of it. The Admiral walked at the front. She was composed, as she had been in everything I had observed from her. She looked at the corridor, at the people watching, at the formal diplomatic signage lining the walls, and she looked like someone who had imagined this moment many times, and was now experiencing the reality of it, which is always different from the imagination, and was taking careful note of the differences. She saw me, because I was standing at the end of the corridor as the designated meeting point. She walked to me and stopped. She was slightly shorter than I had expected. She had the kind of posture that comes not from training, but from a lifetime of being the person others look toward when things are uncertain. She said, "Vel Karath 7, the archivist." I said yes. She said, "You found the file." I said yes. She looked at me for a moment with that direct, weighing quality I had noticed in many of the garrison people, the look of someone assessing not your rank or your credentials but your character. Then she said, "Thank you for looking." It was 4 words, simple ones. I have thought about them many times since. I did not do anything extraordinary. I found a file. I read it. I called the Director of External Affairs. Those are small actions. They should not need to be thanked. The fact that they did, the fact that something as basic as reading an old file and making a phone call constituted an act worthy of gratitude, says something that I did not fully absorb in the moment, but that I have been absorbing slowly ever since. The formal negotiations began the following morning. The session room was a conference space on the Bureau's 3rd floor, neutral territory in the sense that it belonged to the archival department rather than any diplomatic or political division. Sova Marath had arranged this specifically because she wanted the setting to communicate that this was a conversation about record and fact, not a power negotiation between competing interests. Whether the setting communicated that successfully, I cannot say. What I can say is that the first session began with Nora Ashby setting the complete garrison archive on the table, all 800 years of it, organized by period and cross-indexed with Coalition event records for context, and saying that she would like to begin by establishing a shared factual foundation before moving to any discussion of terms. The Coalition team agreed. They spent the entire first morning going through the archive together, Coalition staff reading garrison records, garrison staff cross-referencing against Coalition documents, not arguing, not assigning blame, establishing, piece by piece, what had actually happened, in the order it had actually happened, so that there could be no room for disagreement about the facts before they began discussing what the facts meant. I have sat through many negotiations in my career. I have never sat through one quite like that. There was something almost unbearable about it. The careful, methodical process of building a shared understanding of 800 years of neglect. The Coalition staff found documents they had not known existed. The garrison team confirmed details that had been preserved in their archive, but that had never been externally verified. There was a moment, somewhere in the late morning, when Callum Baird pointed to a Coalition administrative memo from 420 cycles ago, a routine reclassification notice that had been sent in bulk to all frontier postings, and noted quietly that the garrison had never received it because the frequency was already dead. A Coalition staff member pulled up the original distribution log and confirmed that the Sol system posting was listed on the distribution, with a delivery acknowledgement that had been automatically generated by the dead processing queue. The delivery acknowledgement. The system had marked the message as delivered because it was received by the dead queue. No human had read it. but the log said delivered. The coalition staff member who found this looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Nora Ashby. Nora Ashby did not say anything. She simply made a note in the record. That was the moment, I think, when the coalition team fully understood the scale of what they were dealing with. Not the 800 years, not the fleet, or the stations, or the millions of people. The delivery acknowledgement. The system that had said yes, message received, everything fine, for centuries, while the messages went into a void. The administrative silence had hidden itself from its own administrators. The formal terms discussion did not begin until the second day. The first day was entirely consumed by the establishment of shared facts. The terms discussion began on the second morning, and it did not go the way anyone, on either side, had entirely anticipated. The coalition team had prepared a proposal. Sova Marath had worked on it for several days, consulting with the Director General and the Security Council, trying to arrive at something that was generous, without being reckless, that acknowledged the neglect without setting precedents, that would destabilize existing membership structures, and that moved the Sol system posting into an active, recognized status in a way that could be managed administratively. It was a good proposal by the standards of coalition diplomacy. It offered upgraded membership classification, a formal seat on the Outer Rim Advisory Board, and a substantial resource commitment to infrastructure support in the corridor. The Admiral listened to the full proposal without interrupting. When Sova Marath finished, the Admiral was quiet for a moment. Then she asked a single question. She said, "What classification of membership does the Drellin hegemony hold?" Sova Marath said, "Full member, Security Council seat." The Admiral said, "What classification of membership does the Veth remnant hold?" Sova Marath said, "Full member, Security Council seat." The Admiral said, "What classification of membership does the Sulvan collective hold?" Sova Marath said, "Full member, Security Council seat." The Admiral then said, "The Sol system posting has protected a frontier border and maintained 3 species under coalition charter obligation for 800 years. The Drellin hegemony, the Veth remnant, and the Sulvan collective between them have faced 4 border disputes and contributed to approximately 200 cycles of active coalition governance. We are not asking to be treated better than any of them. We are asking to be treated the same." There was no raising of the voice. There was no display of grievance. There was simply a comparison laid on the table with the same methodical clarity that Nora Ashby had brought to the factual record the day before. The coalition team asked for a recess. In the recess, I sat with Sova Marath in a small side room, and she said to me, "They are not wrong." I said I knew. She said, "The Security Council is going to resist. A permanent Security Council seat for a species that has been dormant in our records for 8 centuries is going to be framed as destabilizing." I said, "She is going to point out that they were not dormant. We were." Sova Marath was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, she is." The recess lasted 4 hours. When we returned to the table, Sova Marath presented a revised framework. It acknowledged the legitimacy of the garrison's argument directly, which is not something coalition diplomatic proposals typically do. They usually find ways to accommodate positions without acknowledging that the other side has simply been correct. But Sova Marath, to her considerable credit, chose clarity over the usual diplomatic hedging. She said, "You are right, and here is what we are prepared to do about it. Full membership, Security Council seat, retroactive status dating to the original charter, and a formal accounting of the outstanding support obligations that had never been fulfilled, the resupply shipments, the infrastructure commitments, the salary and operational cost support that a properly functioning posting would have received across 8 centuries." That last item was the one that made the room go very still. Callum Baird was the one who had prepared the garrison's calculation of outstanding obligations. He had been a logistics director for 22 years before these negotiations, and he had the particular quality of someone who understands supply chains and resource flows at a level that goes beyond professional. It was embedded in the way he thought about every problem, the way he moved through any discussion of materials and costs and quantities. He had, in the months before our contact mission arrived, completed a full accounting of what the posting had spent, built, and contributed, measured against what the coalition had committed in the charter. He set the figure on the table. I am not going to write the full number. I have my reasons for this, which I have explained in the classified annex to this account. What I will say is that the figure was large enough that 2 members of the coalition team asked if it was an error, and Callum Baird spent 45 minutes walking through the methodology to demonstrate that it was not. The garrison did not demand payment of the full amount. The admiral had been clear before the session that demanding full payment was not the goal. The goal was acknowledgement. The goal was for the coalition to look at the number, which represented 800 years of service conducted without the support that had been promised, and to understand the scope of what had been left undone. They understood the scope. What the garrison proposed, in place of direct payment, was a development commitment. Infrastructure investment in the corridor, not the coalition building things for the garrison, but the coalition partnering with the garrison to expand and improve what already existed, on a timeline and with a resource allocation that reflected the actual scale of the shortfall. Roads instead of a check, Callum Baird said at one point, which was a human expression that drew blank looks from several people on the coalition side. He translated it: investment in shared future capacity, rather than settlement of a historical debt. The coalition team found this easier to accept than the straight financial accounting, which was obviously the intent. The garrison had anticipated the coalition's institutional constraints and had built their proposal around them. They were, I noted in my personal record, very good at anticipating institutional constraints. 800 years of working around the coalition's absent support structure had apparently produced significant expertise in understanding how large organizations think about what they can and cannot do. There was one more item, the last item on the garrison's list. Callum Baird did not raise it. Nora Ashby did. She waited until every other term had been discussed, cross-referenced, agreed to in principle, and flagged for legal review. She waited until the session had reached the comfortable late afternoon phase, where both teams were tired and the hard work seemed to be behind them. And then she said, in a voice that was conversational and precise, "There is one more thing." She said, "We would like an apology." The room changed when she said that. Not dramatically, not with any visible disruption, but something shifted, like a pressure change in a sealed space. She said, "On the record, signed by the Director General and the Security Council, acknowledging what happened, in factual terms, without euphemism, not expressing regret for an administrative lapse, acknowledging that the Sol system posting was assigned a mission and a charter and a frequency that stopped working, and that no one followed up, and that 9 million people who have never seen Earth were born in a corridor that your records described as uninhabited." She let that sit for a moment. Then she said, "We are not asking for it as a condition of agreement. We are asking for it because it is the right thing to do, and because we believe the coalition is an institution capable of doing the right thing. If we did not believe that, we would not be at this table." The coalition team looked at each other. Then they looked at Sova Marath. Sova Marath said, without hesitation, "We will provide it." It was the first thing she said in the entire 2-day session that did not require careful prior consideration. She simply said it, immediately, because the answer was obvious. Nora Ashby looked at her for a moment. Then she gave a single nod. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of everything that had been building since I found the gray-tagged file on a Tuesday morning in an archive on the 43rd floor. We broke for the day shortly after. I was walking back through the station's corridors toward the transit point when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. It was the Admiral. She was alone, which surprised me. The garrison delegation had traveled as a group throughout. She fell into step beside me without saying why. We walked in silence for a few moments. Then she said, "How did you end up in archives?" I told her the truth. I had been assigned there 17 cycles ago after my first posting did not work out. I told her I had not originally considered archival work as a vocation. I had come to it sideways. She said, "Lucky for us." I said I did not think finding a file constituted anything special. She said, "No, but reading it did." She stopped at a junction, and I realized she was not going the same direction as me. She was heading back toward the garrison quarters. She turned to go, and then she paused and looked back. She said, "The people who kept transmitting into the silence. The ones who sent status reports for 119 years with no answer. They were not doing it because they thought it was working. They were doing it because it was the right practice. Because the right practice has to be maintained whether or not it is being observed." She paused. We needed someone at the other end to do the same thing. You were the one who read the file. Most people who have sat at that desk for 17 cycles and found that file would have tagged it for someone else to review and moved on. I thought about that. I thought about the paper card in faded ink. Follow-up pending. The person who wrote it had meant to come back. I said, I almost did. Move on. She nodded, as if that was the important part, as if the almost was where everything lived. Then she turned the corner and was gone. The Security Council ratification vote was scheduled for 14 days after the preliminary agreement was signed by both negotiating teams. 14 days sounds like a short time. For those of us who had been watching the process from the inside, it felt considerably longer. The preliminary agreement had been published, as required by coalition law, within 48 hours of signing. What followed was not a quiet 2-week waiting period. What followed was the largest public conversation about coalition governance that I could find any record of in the Bureau's archives, and I have records going back significantly further than most people choose to read. The reaction split roughly into 3 categories, which is how public reactions to large and complicated events usually split. There was the group that felt the coalition had done something seriously wrong, and that the agreement was overdue, necessary, and should have happened 8 centuries ago. There was the group that felt the agreement was politically dangerous, that granting a Security Council seat to a species that had been operating outside coalition oversight for 800 years set troubling precedents, and that the situation required more careful study before commitments were made. And there was the largest group, which is always the largest group in these situations, people who had not previously thought very hard about the Keth-Voran corridor, or the Sol system posting, or what the words provisional auxiliary member actually meant, and who were now thinking about all of it very fast and working through how they felt. The coverage of the story was substantial. Every news service in coalition space had journalists trying to reach the corridor, and the KVDF's Public Affairs Office, which had apparently existed for several centuries in anticipation of exactly this kind of situation, staffed by people who had been training for contact scenarios the way you train for something you know will eventually happen, was handling it with the same methodical calm that characterized everything else about the garrison. I watched one of the early interviews from my office. A young journalist from one of the hegemony's major services had traveled to Waypoint Station 7 and was speaking with a garrison resident, a mechanic named Owen Garrett, who had been born on the station 41 years ago. The journalist asked him what it felt like to learn that the coalition was reopening contact. Owen Garrett thought about the question for a moment, the way he probably thought about all questions, and then said, "It's good. It's the right thing. We always knew they'd get here eventually." He paused. "It would have been nice if it had been sooner, but it's good." That was it. No anger in the phrasing, just a careful acknowledgement of both things at once, the good and the too late, and then moving on. That mechanic, speaking for maybe 40 seconds in a news interview, probably conveyed more about the garrison's collective character than any amount of diplomatic documentation could. There were people in the corridor who were not that measured. I want to be honest about that, because otherwise this account edges toward a kind of idealization that would not be accurate. 800 years of isolation produces complex people, and complex people carry complex feelings, and not everyone in the garrison had arrived at Owen Garrett's quiet equanimity. I met some of them during the visit. A young pilot named Remy Cole, perhaps 25 years old, who had grown up on stories of the coalition, the way children grow up on stories of a distant country, whose relationship to their own life is abstract and largely theoretical. She was assigned to escort duty during one of the session breaks, which meant she spent about 30 minutes walking with me through a station corridor, and in that time, she spoke candidly about what the situation meant to her generation. She said, "We grew up knowing the coalition existed. They taught us the history. They taught us why we were here, why the mission mattered, why the frontier needed protecting. They also taught us that the coalition had stopped answering a long time ago." She paused, watching her own words carefully. It was always presented as, not a betrayal exactly, more like a test, like the silence was something we had to prove ourselves through, which I understand. I understand why the elders framed it that way. It kept people focused. It gave the silence a purpose. Another pause. But I grew up, and I started thinking about it differently. The silence was not a test the coalition gave us. The coalition just forgot, and there is a difference between those two things. She was right. There is a difference between those two things. She did not say it with bitterness, particularly. She said it the way young people say true things, when they have spent time arriving at them, with the slightly flat certainty of someone who has examined the comfortable version of an idea and concluded that it is not accurate enough. I included that conversation in the archival record. I believe it belongs there. The Security Council vote happened on the 14th day as scheduled. I was in the chamber for it. Sova Marath sat at the diplomatic table. The garrison delegation observed from the gallery, all 8 of them, in their corridor clothes, watching the chamber with the same careful attention they brought to everything. The vote required a 2/3 majority for ratification. The coalition had 23 Security Council seats at that time. 16 votes were needed. The result was 21 in favor, 1 against, 1 abstention. The member who voted against was the representative of the Baloran Confederation, who had been on record for 3 weeks as opposing the Security Council seat, on the grounds that it altered the existing balance of power. I do not think his opposition was wrong as a political calculation. It did alter the existing balance. I just do not think that was a valid argument against doing it. When the vote count was announced, the chamber was quiet for a moment. Not the long-waited silence of the negotiation sessions. Just a moment. The kind of pause a room takes when something shifts. In the gallery, I watched the Admiral receive the result. She did not visibly react. She was still, looking at the vote display, and her face held the same careful composure it had held throughout. Beside her, Callum Baird let out a slow breath. Nora Ashby, who had been holding a stylus that she had been turning slowly in her hands for the past hour, stopped turning it. Then the Admiral looked down from the gallery at the diplomatic table, and she met Sova Marath's eyes. Sova Marath nodded. The Admiral nodded back. Small, precise, the same kind of gesture that Nora Ashby had made in the negotiation session when Sova Marath agreed to the apology. The gesture that carries everything you cannot quite put into words. The formal signing ceremony was scheduled for the following afternoon. The apology, the specific, factual, signed apology that Nora Ashby had requested, was included in the signing package. I had been asked to read it aloud as part of the ceremony, in my role as archivist, because the apology was being placed permanently in the official coalition historical record, and it was considered appropriate that the person who maintained that record should read it into existence. I had read the draft many times in preparation. I had suggested 2 edits to the language, both of which were accepted. The final version said, in precise terms, that the coalition acknowledged the Sol System frontier posting had been assigned a mission and a charter and a communication frequency that was subsequently deactivated without notification, that the posting had transmitted status reports for 119 years without receiving any response, that 9 million people had been born in the Kethvoran corridor without any acknowledgement of their existence in coalition records, and that this represented a failure of the coalition's obligations to its members that could not be reduced to administrative error and required direct acknowledgement. That is a summary. The actual document used more words, but those were the essential ones. I practiced reading it the night before the ceremony. I sat in my temporary quarters at the bureau and read it out loud to an empty room, trying to find the right pace, the right tone. Not dramatic, not flat, just accurate. The way you read something when you want the words to land in the listener without the reader getting in the way. I kept stopping at the phrase, 9 million people had been born in the Kethvoran corridor without any acknowledgement of their existence in coalition records. Not because it was difficult to read, because every time I read it, I thought about the girl in the corridor at Waypoint Station 9, the one who had pointed at my diplomatic sash. She was one of those 9 million. Born in a place our records said was uninhabited, living a life that our administrative systems had classified as dormant. She was not dormant. None of them were. I read the line. I practiced the pause after it. I went to sleep. The ceremony was held in the Bureau's central hall, which had been arranged for the occasion with additional seating and a small elevated platform at the front. The garrison delegation sat to the left of the platform. The Security Council sat to the right. The Director General, Orath Vel, stood at the center. He spoke first. He offered his own brief remarks, acknowledging what had happened, using the kind of language he used, which is careful and weighted and leaves very little room for ambiguity. Then he stepped back, and I stepped forward to read the apology. The The hall was very quiet. I could hear the ventilation system. I could hear, faintly, the sound of the settlement through the building's outer walls. I could hear my own voice, measured and even, reading the words I had practiced the night before. When I reached the phrase about 9 million people, I felt, for a moment, the presence of all the transmission logs. All 412 pages of them. All 3,000 entries in the dead storage index. Ada Okafor's private notes. Declan Murrow's 11-day standoff against an unmarked fleet. Lieutenant Calloway's message sent through a passing trader. Owen Garrett saying it would have been nice if it had been sooner. Remy Cole saying the difference between a test and someone simply forgetting. I kept reading. That is what you do. When I finished, I stepped back. Orith Vell stepped forward again. He signed the document. He passed it to the garrison delegation. The Admiral signed it. She signed it with the same deliberate precision she brought to everything, and then she passed it to each council member beside her, and each one signed in turn, until all 8 signatures were on the document, alongside the Director General's and the Security Council's official seal. Nora Ashby was the last to sign. She was the one who had asked for it. She signed it, and then she set the pen down and looked at the document for a moment. Then she looked up, at the room, at the officials and staff and observers filling the hall. She did not make a speech. She was not a person who made speeches. She just looked at the room with the direct, clear gaze of someone who is taking careful note of something important. Then she nodded, once. And that was the moment the 800 years ended. What happened in the weeks and months after the signing was, in many respects, harder to navigate than the negotiations themselves. Signing an agreement is a single moment. Living up to it is a sustained effort, and sustained efforts are always where the complications live. The first complication arrived within 3 days of the signing. The Beloran Confederation, whose representative had voted against the ratification, formally requested a review of the Security Council's composition rules. Their argument was procedural. They claimed that the addition of a new permanent member without a corresponding review of overall council structure violated certain interpretations of the coalition's founding charter. The request was not entirely without merit as a legal question. It was also, very obviously, an attempt to delay or dilute the results of a vote that had already happened. The garrison's response to this came not from the Admiral or from Nora Ashby, but from Callum Baird, who sent a memo to the coalition's Legal Affairs Division that was quiet, thorough, and so thoroughly documented that it took the legal team 2 weeks to find a single point to contest. I read that memo. It was one of the most effective pieces of administrative argumentation I have seen in my career. Callum Baird had clearly spent some portion of his 17 years as a logistics director thinking very hard about legal frameworks, because he moved through the Confederation's procedural argument with the familiarity of someone who had anticipated it. He had anticipated it. I asked him about that later, and he said, without any expression of satisfaction, that he had been expecting a procedural challenge since before the vote. He said they had prepared counter-documentation for 7 different possible challenge scenarios. He showed me the list. He was right about which scenario materialized. He was right about all 7, as it happened. 4 of them arrived in the following 6 months, in various forms, from various parties. The Confederation's procedural review was resolved within a month, in the garrison's favor. The other challenges were similarly resolved, on timelines ranging from 2 weeks to 5 months. None of them succeeded in altering the terms of the agreement. I want to be clear that these were not crises. They were the normal friction of a large institution, incorporating a change that required adjustment from established interests. The Confederation was not acting in bad faith exactly. They genuinely felt that the new Security Council seat disrupted a balance they had contributed to maintaining. The frustration was understandable. The proper response was to work through the established processes, rather than to simply accept disruption. They worked through the established processes. The established processes produced a result they disagreed with. That is how it is supposed to work. The more interesting complications were the ones that came from the corridor side. The garrison had spent 800 years developing its own governance structure, its own laws, its own ways of doing things. The Keth Voran Defense Force was not merely a military unit. It was the administrative backbone of everything in the corridor, because in the absence of any external authority, it had necessarily taken on all authority. It governed the stations. It managed the agreements with the Dravathi, the Sulcan, and the Morven Shapers. It maintained the population records, the educational systems, the medical infrastructure. It was, in practical terms, the government of a sovereign territory that had simply never formalized its sovereignty because it had always considered itself part of the coalition, waiting for the coalition to notice. Now the coalition had noticed, and the question of how a military administrative structure with 8 centuries of independent development integrated with a governance framework it had never been part of was not simple. The garrison's approach to this was, predictably, methodical. Nora Ashby led the integration working group, which spent 6 months in what she described as comparative documentation, mapping the garrison's existing laws and structures against the coalition's equivalents, identifying where they were compatible, where they conflicted, and where the coalition's framework simply had no equivalent, because the coalition had never faced the specific conditions the garrison had developed its rules for. There were interesting asymmetries. The garrison had extensive law governing resource allocation in conditions of scarcity, detailed, carefully calibrated rules about distribution and priority during shortage scenarios, developed across centuries of operating without reliable resupply. The coalition had nothing comparable, because coalition members with functioning supply chains had never needed it. Several of the garrison's protocols in this area were eventually adopted, in modified form, as general coalition standards for outer rim postings. Nora Ashby noted this adoption in the integration record, with the same even tone she brought to everything, but I suspect she found it quietly satisfying. The Dravathi, Sulcan, and Morven situations were delicate in different ways. These 3 species had been in relationships with the garrison for centuries. The Dravathi nomads had a mutual defense agreement that was 800 years old, and had been honored without interruption in every cycle of that period. The Sulcan hive clusters had developed a formal communication protocol with the garrison that took decades to establish, and functioned through a combination of physical signaling and translation systems the garrison's linguists had built specifically for Sulcan communication. The Morven Shapers had given the garrison permanent presence rights on 2 of their outer moons, in exchange for navigation and mapping assistance. None of these arrangements were in any coalition database. None had been negotiated with any coalition authority. They were simply real, long-standing relationships between people who had lived alongside each other for generations. The coalition's formal first contact protocols for each of these species were obsolete. In the case of the Sulcan, the official coalition protocol had been written based on first observations made approximately 600 cycles ago, and reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of Sulcan social structure that the garrison had corrected within the first century of contact. I reviewed the official protocol at one point during the integration work, and then I reviewed the garrison's updated version, and the difference between them was remarkable, not as a measure of failure on the coalition's part, but as a measure of what genuine sustained relationship builds compared to initial observations. A coalition diplomat who had arrived at the Sulcan hive clusters using the official protocol would have made a very poor first impression. The garrison had been making very good impressions for 600 years. The integration working group recommended that the coalition formally adopt the garrison's updated protocols for all 3 species. This was accepted without significant debate, which was a small thing but the kind of small thing that matters for what it signals. The coalition acknowledged, in a practical operational context, that the garrison had better information than the coalition did. That is harder for an institution to accept than it sounds. Institutions typically treat their own records as authoritative. The coalition, in this particular domain, looked at the garrison's knowledge and said, "Yours is better. We will use yours." I noted that in the record as well. The physical integration process, the actual movement of people, equipment, and administrative systems, took considerably longer. The corridor was large and the population was distributed across 17 stations and 3 partially terraformed worlds. The coalition's infrastructure commitment, which was substantial, required surveying what existed before planning what to build, and the survey process alone took 8 months. I made a second visit to the corridor during this period, accompanying a bureau assessment team that was documenting the existing infrastructure for the historical record. I went back to Waypoint Station 9. I walked the curved corridor of the old original core section again. I stopped at the Ada Okafor plaque again. She kept the mission. Beside her plaque now, placed recently enough that the adhesive had not yet fully cured to the wall, was a smaller notice. A handwritten note on standard paper, in neat but not formal handwriting. It read, The Coalition has formally acknowledged that this mission was real. Her name is in the record. Below that, initialed rather than signed, were the letters N.A. Nora Ashby had put it there. I stood in that corridor for a long time. I thought about what it means to keep records, not just to maintain them, not just to file and organize and catalog, but to understand that the record is not a description of what happened. The record is the proof that it mattered. The record is how a garrison of 9 million people who were born in a corridor nobody knew existed becomes something more than a fact, becomes a part of history that no one can reclassify as dormant or file in a dead queue or summarize as a lapse in communications. When I came back from the second visit, I requested a transfer. Not out of archives. I had no desire to leave. I requested a transfer to a new position, Director of Outer Rim Postings Review. The position did not exist before I proposed it. I proposed it because the Bureau had, in its current structure, no systematic mechanism for reviewing the status of frontier postings on a regular cycle. There was no process designed to prevent another gray-tagged file from sitting in a dormant sleeve for 800 years, while the people it described kept transmitting into a dead frequency. The position was approved within 2 weeks. I started the work immediately. The first year of full membership was the year the corridor stopped being a secret and became a story. I do not mean that the information was not public before. The announcement had been public from the moment the contact report was published, and the news services had covered it thoroughly. What I mean is that there is a difference between information being available and a story becoming part of how people understand themselves. That second thing takes longer. It requires repetition and reflection and the slow process of something moving from news to history, from recent event to absorbed fact. The story of the Forgotten Legion moved through that process faster than most things I have observed in my career. It moved fast because it had a quality that made it easy to hold in the mind. It was simple at its core. An institution made a promise. The people who received the promise were not watched over, the way a promise typically requires. So they decided to keep the promise themselves, without being watched, for 800 years. And then the institution found the file. That is the story. And it is simple enough that people could carry it with them, could turn it over in conversation, could apply it to other questions in their lives. I heard variations on it everywhere in that first year. On public transit, people would argue about what the Coalition should have done differently and what the humans had done right. In the Bureau's own offices, staff who had never thought much about Outer Rim postings were asking questions about what other frontier files might be in the dormant archive. In schools, the integration of the Sol system posting into Coalition civics curricula happened faster than any educational reform I had previously seen, because teachers understood intuitively that the story was one their students would engage with. The garrison's own people navigated the sudden attention with the composure I had come to associate with everything they did. Fleet Admiral Okafor Vasquez did very few interviews. When she did speak publicly, she was precise and brief. She said once, in response to a journalist who asked how she felt about finally being recognized by the Coalition, that recognition had never been the goal. The goal had been the mission. Recognition was, she said, welcome, but beside the point. The journalist had clearly expected something more expansive. The Admiral gave him 4 words and turned to her next question. Remy Cole, the young pilot I had spoken with during my first visit, became an unexpected public figure. A long-form feature published by one of the hegemony's major journals had included a substantial section on her, the corridor-born generation, their particular relationship to the history of the posting, the way they understood what had happened differently from their parents and grandparents. The feature had been picked up and republished across 9 member worlds, and Remy Cole's photograph, looking at the camera with that direct gaze that corridor people seem to develop as a matter of cultural character, became one of the widely shared images from that period. She handled it, from what I observed, by largely ignoring it. She had work to do. She kept doing it. I saw her again 8 months into that first year, when I was back in the corridor on bureau business. She was on the deck of a patrol vessel when I came through the waypoint station, doing maintenance on a navigation console. She saw me, recognized me, and waved. I waved back. Then she went back to the console. The work did not stop because the story had started. That was, perhaps, the most important thing to understand about the corridor. The mission continued. The patrols ran. The stations were maintained. The agreements with the Dravathi, the Sulcan, and the Morven Shapers were honored, as they had always been honored, regardless of whether anyone was watching. In the Bureau, my work on the Outer Rim Postings Review project was producing results that were uncomfortable in specific ways. A thorough review of the dormant and suspended membership archive revealed that the Sol System posting was unusual in the scale of what had developed during the neglect, but it was not unusual in being neglected. There were 6 other frontier postings in the dormant category that had last received formal contact within the past 50 cycles, and 3 of them had standing communication requests that had not been answered in over a decade. None of them had sent 3,000 transmissions before giving up. None of them had built a fleet in the silence. But they existed, and they were waiting, and the Bureau had not noticed. I brought this to Sova Marath. She brought it to the Director General. The result was a new mandate for my office, a systematic review of all Outer Rim postings, prioritized by length of contact lapse, with a requirement that each one be assessed and contacted within a defined review cycle. It was not dramatic policy. It was exactly the kind of structural change that prevents dramatic policy from being necessary later. The 3 postings with unanswered communications were contacted within 60 days. All 3 responded. None of them had developed anything like what the corridor had become. The lapses were measured in years, not centuries, but all 3 expressed, in their various ways, relief that someone had called. One of them, a small Draylen outpost on the edge of the southern reach, sent a response that I think about sometimes. The outpost commander wrote, "We were beginning to wonder if we had been forgotten. Thank you for calling." Short, simple, not anguished, just the honest observation of someone who had been in a quiet space for too long and was glad to hear a voice. Thank you for calling. As if the mere act of remembering someone existed was enough to matter. I sent a personal note with the Bureau's official response. Not policy, just a note from me to the outpost commander, acknowledging that the gap had been too long, that the review process had been inadequate, and that it was being corrected. She wrote back, "We have exchanged messages 7 times since then. It is not a profound correspondence. It is just 2 people keeping track of each other across the distance." That is the thing the Sol System situation taught me, more than any diplomatic or political lesson it contained. The act of keeping track, the act of looking at a frequency and saying, someone might be transmitting on this, I should check. The act of reading a file, rather than sliding it back into its sleeve, the act of following up. The garrison had done extraordinary things in the silence. They had built and protected and maintained and grown. But the reason any of it had to be extraordinary was that the ordinary thing, simply maintaining contact, simply continuing to check, had not been done. The heroism was, at its root, a response to a failure of something very basic, the failure of routine attention. In the second half of that first year, the corridor began to receive visitors at a scale that stretched the Waypoint Station's capacity for the first time in decades. Not military traffic, not coalition official delegations, ordinary people, citizens of member worlds who had read the story and wanted to see the place. The KVDF Public Affairs Office, still the most well-prepared communications operation I had encountered in any context, handled the increase smoothly. They had policies for visitor registration, designated areas open to public access, and a small team of corridor residents who volunteered to speak with visitors and answer questions. I heard from one of those volunteers, a retired engineer named Isabel Grant who had spent her career maintaining the station's life support systems, that the visitors often said the same few things. They said the stations were different from what they had imagined. They said the people were different, not what the news coverage had led them to expect, though they were rarely able to specify exactly what they had expected. They said they were sorry about what had happened. Isabel Grant told me, with the kind of patient amusement of someone who has heard the same thing many times, "We usually say thank you. What else do you say to that? They mean it genuinely. They are not the ones who forgot us. They just want to express that they understand why it mattered." She paused and then added, "Some of them ask if we are angry. I tell them we were. At various points, the feeling existed, but the mission was the thing that needed the energy. You cannot run a frontier on anger. You need to put the energy somewhere that lasts." She said that last part matter-of-factly, without any sense of performing wisdom, just the observation of someone who had worked for 40 years maintaining the systems that kept 9 million people breathing, and who understood what a waste of a resource anger is when maintenance needs doing. The first year ended with three things happening in close succession that I note together because they belong together. The first, the KVDF fleet conducted a joint training exercise with a coalition border patrol unit, the first combined human coalition military operation in 800 years. I was told it went well, with one notable moment when the coalition patrol commander requested a demonstration of the KVDF's navigation protocols for debris field transit. The KVDF pilots had been navigating the corridor's debris fields, which were significant, for generations without coalition charts because coalition charts had never mapped the corridor. The protocols they had developed were, apparently, substantially more efficient than the standard coalition approach. The demonstration took about 2 hours. The coalition commander asked for a copy of the protocols. He used the word please twice. The second, Nora Ashby completed the integration of the historical archive. Every garrison document, from the first status report sent 847 cycles ago to the most recent daily log entry, was incorporated into the Bureau's main historical collection and made publicly accessible. The indexing alone had taken 8 months and a team of 12. The resulting archive was the most complete continuous record of any frontier posting in coalition history. The third, the Director General's office received a request from the Garrison Council. The KVDF dreadnoughts, it had been noted in several integration discussions, were technologically sophisticated enough to be fully integrated into the coalition's defense structure, but were also old enough that several were approaching the operational limits of their core systems. The coalition had offered to begin a decommissioning and replacement program, which would retire the old ships and provide new coalition standard vessels as replacements. The garrison's request said, simply, that they appreciated the offer and would take the new vessels, which would be very useful for expanding frontier coverage, but that the existing ships would not be decommissioned. They would be maintained, they would continue to fly, and the tallies on their hulls would not be removed or covered. No explanation was offered for this decision in the request itself. I was told that when a coalition official asked for the reasoning, Admiral Okafor Vasquez said, "The ships are part of the record. You do not remove parts of the record." I put that in the official archive. I put everything in the official archive now. The small things and the large ones. The formal agreements and the casual conversations. Isabel Grant's remark about anger and the energy it costs. Remy Cole's exact words about the difference between a test and someone simply forgetting. The child in the corridor who pointed at my sash. Owen Garrett, saying it would have been nice if it had been sooner. These things belong in the record because the record is not only made of official documents, the record is made of the full truth of what happened and who was there and what they said when they thought it through. The official documents tell you what was decided. The full record tells you why it mattered. The second year brought things the first year had only hinted at. The integration of the corridor's 3 protected species into the formal coalition framework was the most complex process I witnessed in that entire period. Not because the Dravathi, the Sulcan, or the Morven Shapers were difficult to work with. In fact, each of them presented far fewer complications than the political debates within the coalition itself had suggested they would. The complexity came from something subtler. The gap between what the coalition's existing frameworks were designed to handle and what these 3 relationships actually were. The coalition had standard protocols for newly contacted species. These protocols assumed a beginning, a first contact moment, a period of observation, then formal introduction, then graduated relationship building over decades or centuries, according to carefully managed timetables. The protocols were designed for situations where the coalition had more information, more institutional experience, and more structural power than the newly contacted party. None of those assumptions applied here. The Dravathi had been in a formal mutual defense relationship with humans for over 7 centuries. Their own historians had records of the garrison going back further than most coalition member species had records of the coalition itself. When the coalition's first contact team arrived to begin the standard introductory process, the Dravathi delegation, patient and dignified nomads who were accustomed to long silences and longer memories, politely indicated that they were aware of what the coalition was, had been aware for some time, and were prepared to establish a formal relationship with the broader body if the broader body was prepared to honor the existing relationship with the garrison. The phrasing of that last condition was not a threat. The Dravathi do not communicate in threats. but it was a clear statement of priority. The garrison relationship came first. The coalition relationship was welcome, but it came after. The coalition team reported this to Sova Marath, who reported it to the Director General, who made the correct decision immediately, which was to agree. The Sulcan situation was more technically demanding. The KVDF's linguistics team had spent over a century developing the translation protocols for Sulcan communication, and those protocols did not transfer easily. The Sulcan communicated in ways that required physical proximity and specific environmental conditions, and the hive cluster social structure meant that any formal agreement required acknowledgement from multiple simultaneous voices that had to be interpreted as a single collective position. The garrison's linguists had learned to navigate this. Coalition linguists had not, because the coalition's existing Sulcan protocol was based on observations made before the garrison's sustained contact period, and was, as I noted earlier, significantly out of date. The garrison's linguistics team worked with the coalition for 8 months before the Sulcan formal recognition agreement was signed. The garrison's lead linguist during this process was a woman named Vera Hughes, who had spent 30 years in Sulcan communication, and described the work, in the integration record, as the most interesting 8 months of a long and interesting career. She meant it as a compliment to both sides. I believe it was accurate. The Morven Shapers were the most different from any species the coalition had previously dealt with in formal diplomatic contexts. They did not move in the way most species move. They operated on geological timescales in some of their decision-making processes, which meant that formal consultation required months of preparation and the patience to receive answers that came slowly and in non-standard forms. The garrison had developed an entire diplomatic subculture around working with the Morven. The people who served as Morven liaisons were specifically trained for it, spent years building the relationship before being trusted with formal negotiations, and understood that silence in a Morven exchange was not absence of response but part of the response. The coalition did not have that subculture. It took time to build. I visited the garrison's Morven liaison station twice during this period. It was on one of the outer moons the Morven Shapers had given the garrison permanent presence rights to, a place of remarkable stillness, where the surface was a dark mineral plain, broken by formations, that the Morven had shaped over centuries, in ways that served purposes the garrison's researchers were still working to fully understand. The liaison station itself was small, deliberately small, built in a style that minimized intrusion on the surrounding landscape. The people who worked there spoke quietly. They moved with particular care. One of the senior liaisons, a man named Liam Vance who had been stationed there for 11 years, showed me around the station and then took me to a viewing point on the exterior surface, where we could see a formation about 2 kilometers away that the Morven had been working on for the previous 40 years. I asked him what it was. He said the garrison's researchers had several theories, but that he personally believed it was a kind of marking, a way the Morven had of indicating that something significant had happened in this location. He said, they started it about 5 years after the first contact with the garrison. The timing suggests it was a response to that contact. But we won't know for certain for at least another century, because that is how long it will take them to finish it. He said this with no impatience at all. He was a man who had chosen a job that required waiting, and he had made his peace with waiting in a way that had clearly become part of how he thought about everything. I asked him how the garrison had learned that patience. Initially, the first people who had worked with the Morven must have found the adjustment significant. He thought about this. Then he said, I think it helped that they'd already spent a long time in silence. When you spend enough time with no answer coming back, you learn that the absence of a quick response does not mean the response is never coming. You learn to stay present. He paused. The garrison's history with the coalition probably prepared them for working with the Morven in a way that most species wouldn't have been prepared. The Morven take their time. So did we. That is the kind of observation that stays with you. The idea that 800 years of waiting in silence had produced, as one of its effects, a population of people who had learned to be exceptionally good at waiting, who could sit with uncertainty and sustained patience in ways that a species with continuous institutional support might not develop. The things the neglect had taken from them were real and documented. The things it had built in them, unexpectedly, were also real. I included that conversation in the record. Toward the end of the second year, something happened that I had not anticipated and that I believe deserves a place here, even though it is smaller than the events around it. The Bureau received a communication from a human student on Thesara Prime. She was studying at the main university, in a program on interstellar history, and she had been assigned a research project on the Sol system integration. As part of her research, she had been reading through the garrison's historical archive, the full publicly accessible version, all 800 years of it, and she had found something. She had found the original paper card from the Sol system file. It had been scanned as part of the archival process when I incorporated the file into the permanent collection, and the scan was part of the public record. The handwritten note, follow-up pending. She had looked at it, and she had looked at the filing date, which was approximately 600 cycles ago, and she had looked at the name on the document it was attached to. The filing clerk's name. I will not repeat the name here because I have no desire to make this account about a single person's administrative failure, but the student had done what good researchers do. She had traced it. She had found records that allowed her to establish that the clerk who had written that note had subsequently been transferred to a different department, and then to another, and had spent the next 30 cycles in increasingly senior positions, and had retired with honors, and had never, in any record the student could find, come back to the follow-up note. The student's question to the Bureau was straightforward. She said, "Is there any record of why the follow-up was not completed? I am trying to understand if this was a deliberate decision or an oversight." I replied to her personally. I told her what the records showed. The clerk had written the note with apparent genuine intention, and then had been moved into a role that absorbed their attention elsewhere, and the file had remained in its sleeve, and at some point, the intention and the file had simply become disconnected from each other. Not a decision, an oversight. The specific kind of oversight that accumulates when people are busy, and there is no system requiring them to return to the things they meant to do. She wrote back. She said she understood. She said she was going to write about it, in her research project, as the mechanism of forgetting, not a choice, but a process. The way something can slip out of the space of active intention without anyone deciding to drop it. I thought that was an accurate way to frame it. I told her so. She submitted her project 2 months later. She sent me a copy. I read it. It was good work, careful, honest, and precise about what the records showed, without over-interpreting them. The central argument was that institutional forgetting rarely happens as a decision. It happens as a series of small redirections, each one individually defensible, that collectively produce an absence. I have recommended it for the Bureau's recommended reading list. There are things you cannot unknow after reading 800 years of transmissions sent into silence. One of them is how easy it is for the mechanism of forgetting to work, how the gray sleeve closes and the label says dormant, and the days pass, and the people at the other end of the dead frequency keep transmitting because they have no reason to know the frequency is dead. The student's paper called this the accumulation of inattention. I think that is the right phrase for what happened in the Kethvoran corridor. Not malice, not deliberate abandonment, an accumulation of inattention, compounding across cycles and departments and personnel changes, until a 9 million person civilization existed in a space the Coalition described as uninhabited. The answer to the accumulation of inattention is not punishment. It is not apology alone, though apology is necessary. It is the building of systems that make inattention structurally harder, that create regular checkpoints, that require someone to answer the question, "Have we heard from them lately?" on a schedule that does not permit the answer to drift into vagueness. That is what the Outer Rim Postings Review Office does. That is what I do now, every day, in addition to the archival work that has been my career. I check the list. I look at the communication logs. I find the ones that have not been answered recently enough. I make the call. It is not dramatic work, but I have learned, from reading those 412 pages of status reports sent without response, that the undramatic work is the work that matters most. The daily practice. The kept appointment. The followed-up note. She kept the mission. Those 4 words on a wall in a corridor on a station that our maps said did not exist. I want every file on my desk to eventually be able to say the same. That someone kept it. That someone came back to it. That the follow-up pending became the follow-up done. 3 years after the signing ceremony, I went back to the corridor one last time, for a reason that had nothing to do with bureau business. I went because Nora Ashby had invited me. She sent a formal invitation to my personal address, not the bureau account, which meant it was not official, and she had not sent it as the garrison's historical keeper, but as herself. The invitation said, the garrison was observing the anniversary of the signing. There would be a gathering at Waypoint Station 9. It would not be large. The corridor did not go in for large public ceremonies as a matter of cultural preference. But she said she thought I might want to be there. I took personal leave and went. The corridor felt different the third time. Not physically. The dark, weathered stations, the precise patrol patterns of the KVDF vessels, the particular quality of light inside a habitat that has been lived in by multiple generations. All of that was the same. What had changed was the sense of it. The first time I arrived, the corridor had felt, to me, like a discovery. The second time, it had felt like a site of ongoing work. This time it felt like a place. A real place where people lived, in the simple and complete sense that phrase has when you stop thinking about a location in any other terms. The gathering was at Station 9's old central hall, the one near the council chamber. About 300 people, maybe a few more. Garrison staff, council members, some of the people who worked at the Dravathi liaison post, 2 representatives from the Sulcan Hive cluster who communicated through their human translators in a quiet, steady exchange at one side of the room. The Morven were not present, but a message from the liaison station was read aloud, a translation of something the Morven had expressed to Liam Vance on the outer moon, in their slow way, which he had done his best to render into words. It said, approximately, that the Shapers acknowledged a change, and that they considered the change good. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of gathering where people who have been through something large together stand in the same room and do not need to explain to each other what it meant. The explaining has already been done. The records have been made. The thing has been placed in history. Now you stand together and let it be in the past, which is the final stage of any lived experience. Admiral Okafor Vasquez was there. She stood near the back of the room for most of the evening, which is where I tend to stand at gatherings, so at one point we were standing near each other without having arranged it. We watched the room for a while without speaking. Then she said, without looking at me, "How is the review office going?" I told her it was going well. 11 additional postings contacted in the past year. No situation approaching anything like the corridor, but 3 that had needed attention and had received it. She said, "Good." Another pause. I asked her how she felt about everything. All of it. The way things had settled. She thought about the question for longer than most people would. The Admiral always took the full time that a question required. Then she said, "It is strange, some days to be known. We spent 800 years being very good at not being known, at operating without reference to anyone outside the corridor. We built our entire culture around it. The self-sufficiency, the internal record-keeping, the patience." She was quiet for a moment. "And now we are known. We have a seat on the Security Council. People travel here on holiday. They read the archive. They say they are sorry." She shook her head slightly, not with irritation, but with the expression of someone working through something genuinely complex. The mission has not changed. The work has not changed. But the context has. And the context changes how things feel, even when the work is the same. I said I thought that was an honest way to put it. She said, "The hardest part, if I'm being honest, and I am being honest, this is the 3rd anniversary and I feel entitled to some honesty. The hardest part is the younger generation. The Remy Cole generation. They grew up in the silence. They understood themselves through the silence. And now the silence is over, and they have to understand themselves some other way." She paused again. "Most of them are doing fine. People adapt, but some of them needed the silence to be a defining thing, and they are not entirely sure what defines them now." I thought about Remy Cole waving from the maintenance deck and going back to her work. I said I thought doing the work was probably still the defining thing, even when people were watching. The Admiral considered this. Then she said, "Yes, that is what I think too. But it takes some people longer to find that again after the context changes." We stood together a little longer. Around us, people talked and moved, and the Sulcan translators worked in their quiet corner, and someone near the door was laughing at something, and the children who were too young to remember the first contact year were simply living in the room the way children live in rooms, completely and without historical awareness, which is how rooms are meant to be lived in. Callum Baird found us eventually. He brought 3 drinks in cups that were old enough to have a history attached to them. The kind of cups you keep because they were made in the early days of the station, and still work, and there is no reason to replace what still works. He handed one to each of us and kept one for himself. He said, 3 years. The Admiral said, 3 years. He looked at me. You should have gotten here sooner, he said, but there was no edge to it. It was the kind of thing you can say, 3 years on, when the outcome has been what it has been. I said, yes. He nodded. He was satisfied with that. He drank from his old cup and looked at the room with the expression of a logistics director who has, for once, found everything in order. I want to record what I observed in that room. I want to record it precisely, and not with more sentiment than it deserves, because the historical record should not be sentimental, but it should be complete. What I observed was people who had been through something that required them to be exceptional, and who had been exceptional, and who were now standing in a room together simply being ordinary, in the way that all people are ordinary when they are not required to be anything else. They were tired in the easy way you are tired at the end of a good day. They were happy in the specific, quiet way you are happy, when something that has been unresolved for a long time has finally been resolved. They knew each other deeply in the way that people know each other when they have been through the same things across generations. Not just acquaintances, but the kind of known that goes down into the bones. And they were here, still here, as the ship's name put it, still present in the corridor where they had been assigned, and where they had stayed, not because they had been required to stay, but because this was their place, and the mission was their mission, and those two things had been enough. I left the corridor the following morning. I stood at the docking port for a moment before boarding the transit vessel and looked out at the station through the port window. The dark hull of a KVDF cruiser was visible at the next berth over, moving out on patrol, its weathered surface catching the corridor's ambient light. The tallies along its bow were too small to read from this distance, but I knew they were there. I have been at my desk in the archive every day since that visit. The work does not change. Sorting, cataloging, reviewing, following up, the morning routine, the communication logs to check, the postings to contact, the files that have not been opened recently enough and need to be opened. Every file contains something, a population, a mission, a promise. Sometimes it is a small thing, a dozen researchers at an outpost on the far edge of a surveyed sector, doing work that nobody at the center of the coalition has thought about in 20 cycles. Sometimes it is a single monitoring post, staffed by 3 individuals, making observations that feed into databases that no one has reviewed recently. It is rarely 800 years and 9 million people. It is usually smaller than that. But small things become large things through the accumulation of inattention, and large things become manageable through the consistency of small, regular acts of attention. I open the files. I read what is in them. I check the communication logs. I ask, for every posting where the answer is not immediately clear, when did we last hear from them? When did they last hear from us? I find the ones that have been quiet too long. I make the call. It is not the work I imagined for myself when I began the archive posting 17 cycles ago. It is more than I imagined, in the way that things are more when you understand why they matter. I think about the paper card sometimes, the handwriting, follow-up pending, the honest note left by someone who intended to come back and never did, not from cruelty, not from decision, from the accumulation of other things that seemed more urgent, that filled the space where the follow-up should have been. I am the follow-up now. That is the most honest description of the work. I am the mechanism that does not let the cards stay in the sleeve. I am the person who opens the frequency and asks, in the careful and professional language that I learned to recognize from 412 pages of transmissions sent without response, whether anyone is out there and whether they are all right. And they are, most of them. They are out there, doing the work, keeping the mission, waiting for someone to call. I call. Every day, I call. This account is filed in the Coalition Historical Record Bureau, under the designation Sol System Integration, Primary Narrative Account. It is also filed in the Garrison's own archive on Waypoint Station 9, at the request of Nora Ashby, under the designation How It Happened, in full, from the outside. Both of those are the right place for it. The record belongs in both places. The record belongs everywhere that people might read it and understand what it means to keep the mission when the mission is yours, and the silence on the other end of the frequency is not a sign that you should stop. It is a sign that you should keep transmitting. And somewhere, eventually, someone will read the file. Filed by Velkarath 7, Senior Archivist and Director of Outer Rim Postings Review, Coalition Historical Record Bureau, Thesara Prime. There is one more thing I want to include in this account. Not because it is dramatic or because it changes the shape of the events I have described, but because it happened, and the things that happened deserve to be in the record. 4 months after the 3rd anniversary gathering, I received a package at the Bureau. A physical package, delivered through the interstellar postal system, which is slow and reliable in the particular way that slow and reliable things are. The return address was Waypoint Station 9. Inside the package was a small object wrapped in plain cloth. When I unwrapped it, I found a piece of the station's original wall material. Not a large piece, palm-sized, taken from somewhere the modification would not be noticed. It was the dark alloy of the original construction, bearing the particular weathered quality of 800 years of use. On one side, someone had made a mark in the metal, not deeply carved, but clear, a small set of tallies. 5 marks, crossed, 10, 15, 20. 20 marks. There was a handwritten note with it. The handwriting was familiar. Nora Ashby's handwriting, precise and clear. The note said, "For the archivist, the garrison counts what matters. We counted 20 postings followed up in 2 years, according to the report your office published last cycle. We thought you should have something to mark time with. 20 postings, 11 in the first year, 9 in the second. 20 calls made to places that had been quiet too long. 20 times a voice had gone into a frequency and asked if anyone was there, and someone had answered. I put the piece of wall material on the corner of my desk. It is there now, as I write this. It is not decorative. It is the kind of object that simply exists in a space and tells you, by existing, that the work is real, and the count is real, and every mark on it corresponds to something that actually happened. 20, so far. The number will grow. I intend for it to grow. That is the work. The garrison has a saying that I did not learn until the 3rd visit. It is not in any official document. It is the kind of saying that lives in the culture, rather than the record, passed between people, as the kind of thing you say when someone asks what keeps you going in the silence. I heard it from a young technician at Station 9, who was explaining to a visitor what the work felt like, day to day, in the practical reality of maintaining a frontier posting. The saying is, "The mission does not end when no one is watching. It only begins then." I have written that sentence on a small piece of paper and placed it beside the wall fragment on my desk. The mission does not end when no one is watching. It only begins then. That is the lesson. That is the whole lesson. Everything else in this account, the 800 years, the 3,000 transmissions, the fleet and the stations, and the 9 million people, and the negotiations, and the apology, and the Security Council seat. Everything else is what happens when the lesson is kept by the people who were given the mission, and then finally, eventually, understood by the people who gave it. We gave them a posting and a charter and a frequency. We forgot about the frequency. We forgot about the charter. We forgot about the posting. They did not forget. And when we finally remembered, what we found in the place we had abandoned was not ruins or resentment, or a people who had given up and scattered. What we found was a civilization, a real one, with history and culture and law, and children who did not know our names, but knew their own names, and their own mission, and the names of every person who had kept that mission across every generation since the beginning. We found the Forgotten Legion, and they were not what the name suggests. They were not lost. They were not diminished. They were not broken by the silence. They were what happens when people take a mission seriously enough to keep it without any external requirement to do so, across a span of time so long that the original requirement itself became history. They were what the word mission actually means when it stops being a word and starts being a practice. I am not a human. I did not live the 800 years. I did not grow up on a station that no one's maps acknowledged. I have not spent my life in a corridor the Coalition described as uninhabited. I can read the records and I can walk the stations and I can listen to Isabel Grant and Remy Cole and Callum Baird and the Admiral herself, and I can do my best to understand. What I understand is this. The story of the Keth-Voren corridor is not a story about extraordinary people who did extraordinary things. It is a story about ordinary people who did ordinary things for an extraordinarily long time, without being watched, without being acknowledged, without any external confirmation that the doing mattered. They kept the lights on, they maintained the equipment, they honored the agreements they had made with their neighbors, they filed the reports, they kept the mission. And on a Tuesday, in an archive on the 43rd floor of a building on Thesara Prime, someone finally read the file. I read the file. I put it back in the gray sleeve and sat at my desk and did not immediately do anything at all. Then I picked up my communicator and called the Director of External Affairs and told her what I had found. That is the story. All of it. From the finding, to the follow-up, to the 20 marks on a piece of station wall sitting on my desk. From the faded handwriting on a paper card, to the formal apology signed in a ceremony in the Coalition's Central Hall. From the 412-page communication log that no one had read to the complete Garrison archive that now anyone can read. Every entry, every name, every transmission sent into silence, and every response that eventually, finally, came back. The record is complete. I have made sure of it. The follow-up is done.